I was alone in the hospital with my husband during his final days. Other rooms were filled with families. Ours was silent. No one came. When the doctor confirmed his passing, he handed me the farewell letter. Open the safe. It'll all make sense. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The beeping of the heart monitor had become my heartbeat. For 7 days, I sat in that uncomfortable vinyl chair beside Carlton's hospital bed, watching his chest rise and fall with mechanical precision. Room 314 had become my world, and it was the loneliest place on earth. Down the hall, room 312 was a constant parade of visitors. I could hear children's laughter mixing with adult conversations, the rustle of flower arrangements being moved around, chairs scraping as people made room for more family members. Yesterday, I counted 12 people crammed into that room, celebrating because their patriarch had opened his eyes for the first time in a week. Our room stayed silent, except for the machines keeping my husband alive. I'm Everly, and I'm 69 years old. Carlton is 71, though the man lying before me looks ancient, his once strong hands now translucent and fragile. We've been married for 47 years, and in all that time, I never imagined I'd face his final days alone. Mrs. Patterson? Dr. Ross appeared in the doorway, his expression gentle but serious. He was younger than my son Mark, probably in his early 40s, with kind eyes that had delivered too much bad news. How are you holding up? I attempted a smile that felt more like a grimace. I'm fine, doctor. Has there been any change? He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. I'm afraid not. His vitals are stable, but he paused, choosing his words carefully. Have you been able to reach your family? The question hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it. Dr. Ross had asked the same thing 3 days ago, and the day before that. Each time, I gave him the same lie. They're coming, I whispered, my voice barely audible. They live far away. Dr. Ross nodded, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He'd been Carlton's primary physician for 2 weeks now, since the stroke brought us rushing to the emergency room. He'd seen the empty visitor log outside our door. He'd noticed that no flowers arrived, no get well cards accumulated on the windowsill. Mrs. Patterson, he said gently. Is there anyone I can call for you? A friend, perhaps? You shouldn't be going through this alone. The kindness in his voice almost broke me. Almost. But I'd learned over the years how to swallow my pain, how to keep my dignity intact even when everything around me was crumbling. Thank you, Dr. Ross, but I'm managing just fine. He lingered for another moment, clearly wanting to say more, then gave me a small nod. I'll be back to check on him in a few hours. Please, call the nurses if you need anything at all. After he left, I sank back into that awful chair and stared at Carlton's peaceful face. Even unconscious, even dying, he looked like he was waiting for something, or someone. The truth was, I had tried to reach our children. Mark lived in Seattle with his wife Jennifer and their 2 teenage kids. He was some kind of executive at a tech company. The kind of success Carlton and I had always dreamed our son would achieve. Sandra lived in Phoenix with her husband Derek and their 3 children. She managed a high-end boutique and lived in one of those fancy gated communities. I'd called Mark first, the morning after Carlton's stroke. Hello? His voice had been rushed, impatient. Mark, it's Mom. Your father's in the hospital. He's had a stroke. A long pause. How bad is it? Bad. The doctors aren't sure if he'll wake up. I think you should come. Another pause. Longer this time. Mom, I'm in the middle of a huge project at work. Can you keep me updated? If things get really serious, call me back. If things get really serious? As if his father fighting for his life wasn't serious enough, Sandra's response had been even worse. Mom, I can't just drop everything. Do you know how much a last-minute flight costs? Besides, Dad's tough. He'll pull through this. That was 5 days ago. Neither of them had called back to check. I looked around our sterile room, taking in the blank walls, the single window that faced the parking lot, the empty chair that should have held one of our children. In room 312, someone was singing Happy Birthday off-key, and everyone was laughing. How had we gotten here? How had Carlton and I, who had devoted our entire lives to raising Mark and Sandra, ended up so completely alone? I reached over and took Carlton's hand, careful not to disturb the 4th line. His skin was cold, but I could still feel the calluses from 40 years of construction work. These hands had built our first house, had taught Mark how to throw a baseball, had braided Sandra's hair when she was little. I'm here, sweetheart, I whispered. I'm right here. The machines continued their rhythmic beeping, the only witnesses to our vigil. Outside our door, life went on. Families reunited, people celebrated small victories, children brought handmade cards to their grandparents. But in room 314, there was only me, Carlton, and the growing certainty that we would face whatever came next, exactly as we were facing it now, together but utterly alone. As evening approached and visiting hours ended, I prepared for another night in that chair. The nurses had offered me a cot, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. What if Carlton woke up? What if he needed me? What if these were our last hours together, and I missed them because I was sleeping? So I stayed awake, holding his hand, and tried not to think about the empty chairs that surrounded us. As I sat in that hospital chair, watching Carlton's chest rise and fall, my mind drifted back to the moment everything changed. It was 11 years ago, and Carlton had just turned 60. He'd been working construction for Brennan & Associates for 23 years, starting as a laborer and working his way up to site supervisor. He was proud of that job, proud of the houses and buildings that stood as testament to his hard work. Then the economy crashed, and everything fell apart. I remember the morning he came home early, his face gray with shock. He'd been laid off, along with half the crew. At 60, with a bad back and hands worn down by decades of manual labor, Carlton suddenly found himself competing for jobs with men half his age. It's temporary, he kept saying those first few weeks. Construction always bounces back. But months passed, and the callbacks never came. Carlton's confidence began to crumble like mortar in the rain. He'd leave the house every morning in his good clothes, armed with resumes and determination, only to return each evening a little more defeated. That's when Mark started pulling away. My son had always been ambitious, driven to succeed in ways Carlton and I never were. He'd earned his business degree, landed that good job in Seattle, married Jennifer, who came from money. When Carlton lost his job, I think Mark saw it as a personal embarrassment. I'll never forget the Thanksgiving dinner that year. Mark and Jennifer had driven down with the kids, and Carlton was so excited to see them. He'd been unemployed for 8 months by then, but he was still hopeful, still trying to project strength. "So, Dad," Mark said over dinner, his tone casual but cutting, "any luck with the job search?" Carlton straightened in his chair. "I've got a few leads. Interview next week with a landscaping company." "Landscaping?" Mark's voice carried just enough disdain to make everyone uncomfortable. "Isn't that a step backward?" "Work is work, son," Carlton replied quietly. Mark shook his head. "I don't understand how you let this happen. Didn't you see the signs? Didn't you plan for this?" The table went silent. Even the kids stopped eating. Carlton's face went red, but not with anger, with shame. "Mark," I started to say, but Carlton put his hand on my arm. "Your father worked hard for 23 years, I said anyway. He didn't choose to get laid off." Mark's wife Jennifer, who usually stayed quiet during family discussions, chose that moment to speak up. "Maybe this is an opportunity for a fresh start. There are lots of options for people Carlton's age. Walmart always needs greeters." The words hung in the air like poison. Carlton excused himself from the table, and I found him later in the garage, sitting on his workbench with his head in his hands. After that Thanksgiving, Mark's visits became less frequent. His phone calls grew shorter and more superficial. When Carlton finally found work 6 months later, doing maintenance for the school district, Mark barely acknowledged it. The new job paid half of what he'd made in construction, but Carlton was grateful to be working again. Sandra's reaction was different, but equally painful. Where Mark pulled away out of embarrassment, Sandra pulled away out of disappointment. She'd grown accustomed to a certain lifestyle after marrying Derek, who worked in real estate and did well for himself. She lived in a beautiful house with a pool, drove a luxury SUV, sent her kids to private schools. Somewhere along the way, she'd started to expect that level of comfort from everyone around her. "Mom, why don't you and Dad move to a smaller place?" she'd suggested during one of her increasingly rare visits. "That house is too big for just the two of you now. And clearly Dad's not making the same money he used to." The house she was talking about was the one Carlton had built with his own hands when Mark was 5 and Sandra was 3. Every board, every nail, every inch of drywall represented his love for our family. The idea of leaving it was devastating to him. "We're managing just fine," I told her. Sandra had looked around our modest living room with barely concealed disdain. "Are you, though? When's the last time you had the carpets cleaned or updated the kitchen? Mom, you're living like poor people." Poor people. As if falling on hard times made us somehow lesser than we'd been before. The real breaking point came 2 years later, when Sandra called asking for money. Her third child had just been born, and Derek's business was going through a rough patch. They needed $5,000 to cover some medical bills and catch up on the mortgage. Carlton didn't hesitate. He cashed in part of his small retirement fund and sent her the money, even though it meant we'd be eating beans and rice for months. Sandra never paid it back. Worse, she never even acknowledged the sacrifice he'd made for her. When Derek's business recovered 6 months later and they took a vacation to Hawaii, posting pictures all over Facebook, Carlton didn't say a word, but I saw the hurt in his eyes. After that, the distance between us and our children became a chasm. Mark's visits dwindled to once a year at Christmas, and even then he seemed anxious to leave. Sandra would call occasionally, usually when she needed something, but her visits stopped altogether. Carlton began to blame himself. "I failed them," he'd say during his darker moments. "I was supposed to provide for my family, and I couldn't even keep a job." "You didn't fail anyone," I'd tell him. "You gave them everything you had." But deep down, I wondered if he was right. Had we somehow raised children who valued success over loyalty? Who saw their father's worth only in terms of his paycheck? Sitting in that hospital room now, I realized that Carlton had spent the last 11 years of his life trying to win back their respect. He'd worked overtime at the school district, taken on weekend jobs, all to prove he wasn't the failure they seemed to think he was. And in the end, none of it mattered. When he needed them most, when he was fighting for his life in a sterile hospital room, they were too busy, too distant, too embarrassed to be there. The irony wasn't lost on me. Carlton had built houses that would stand for generations, had raised children who achieved the success he'd always dreamed of for them. But when his own foundation crumbled, when his own walls started to fall, there was no one left to help him rebuild, except me. There was always me. I squeezed his hand tighter, feeling the wedding ring that had never left his finger in 47 years. "I'm still here, Carlton," I whispered. "I'll always be here." But as the machines continued their lonely vigil, I couldn't shake the feeling that soon, even I wouldn't be enough. The end came on a Tuesday morning, quiet and unremarkable as dawn broke over the hospital parking lot. I'd fallen asleep holding Carlton's hand sometime around 4 in the morning, my head resting against the side rail of his bed. The change in the rhythm of the machines woke me. Dr. Ross was there within minutes, along with 2 nurses whose faces I'd grown to know over the past week. They moved with practiced efficiency, checking monitors, adjusting equipment, but I could see in their eyes what they already knew. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Ross said gently, his hand on my shoulder. "I'm so sorry." I nodded, unable to speak. Somehow I'd known this moment was coming, but the finality of it still hit me like a physical blow. Carlton was gone. After 47 years of marriage, I was truly alone. The next hour passed in a blur of paperwork and quiet conversations. The nurses were kind, giving me time to say goodbye, to sit with Carlton's peaceful face one last time. He looked younger somehow. The lines of worry and pain finally smoothed away. As I gathered my few belongings from the room, Dr. Ross approached me with a manila envelope in his hands. "Your husband asked me to give this to you," he said quietly. "He gave it to me 3 days ago when he was still conscious. He made me promise to only give it to you after everything was finished." My hands trembled as I took the envelope. It was heavier than I expected, and I could feel something small and metallic inside, along with what felt like folded papers. "He was very specific about when you should receive this," Dr. Ross continued. "He seemed to think it was important that you read it alone." I thanked him and made my way to the parking lot, the envelope clutched against my chest. The morning sun felt too bright, the world too loud and alive for a day when my husband had just died. I sat in my car for a long time before I found the courage to open his final message to me. Inside was a small brass key and a letter written in Carlton's careful handwriting. "My dearest Everly, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing the hardest part alone. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but mostly I'm sorry that our children weren't there when you needed them most. I need you to go home and go to our bedroom closet. Behind my old work boots you'll find our safety deposit box. The key in this envelope opens it. I've left you something there, something I've been working on for years. But before you open that box, I want you to know that loving you was the greatest privilege of my life, even when everything else fell apart. Even when I felt like I'd failed everyone who mattered to me, you never stopped believing in me. You never stopped standing by my side." The password to the box is the day we met. October 15, 1975. "Do you remember? You were wearing that blue dress and you laughed at my stupid joke about the weather. I knew that day I was going to marry you, even though it took me 3 months to work up the courage to ask you out. I love you, Everly. I always have. And wherever I am now, I always will. Forever yours, Carlton." By the time I finished reading, tears were streaming down my face. I could hear his voice in every word, could picture him writing this letter in secret, knowing he might not survive to say these things to me in person. The drive home felt surreal. Everything looked the same. The same streets, the same houses, the same oak tree in our front yard that Carlton had planted when Mark was born. But nothing would ever be the same again. Our house felt impossibly empty. 47 years of shared life echoed in every room, but now it was just echoes. I made myself a cup of coffee with shaking hands and sat at our kitchen table, staring at the brass key. When I finally found the courage to go to our bedroom, I discovered that Carlton had been more secretive than I'd realized. Behind his old work boots, exactly where he'd said, was a small fireproof safe I'd never seen before. The digital lock blinked patiently, waiting for the date that had changed both our lives. 101,575. The lock clicked open. Inside was more money than I'd expected. Several $1,000s in cash, along with my grandmother's pearl necklace that I thought had been lost years ago, and a few other pieces of jewelry I hadn't seen since we'd hidden them away for safekeeping. But what took my breath away was the leather-bound journal sitting on top of everything else. My name was written on the cover in Carlton's handwriting, and underneath it, what they never knew. With trembling fingers, I opened to the first page. January 3, 2013. Mark's birthday. Everly made his favorite cake and we waited by the phone all day. He never called. She tried to hide how much it hurt, but I saw her crying in the kitchen later. I should have done something. I should have been stronger for her. I flipped to another page, chosen at random. June 15, 2015. Sandra called today asking for money again. She said it was for the kids' school supplies, but I saw on Facebook that Derek bought a new boat last week. Everly doesn't know about the Facebook account I made to keep track of them. She'd be heartbroken if she knew how they really spend their money. I cashed in another CD to send Sandra what she asked for. I'll tell Everly it was a good investment that matured. Page after page, year after year, Carlton had documented every slight, every missed holiday, every unreturned phone call. But more than that, he'd recorded every sacrifice he'd made to try to bridge the gap between us and our children. November 24, 2016. Thanksgiving. Mark didn't come again, third year in a row. Everly set a place for him anyway, just in case. I found her throwing away the untouched plate after dinner. I told her we had a nice quiet holiday, just the two of us, but I know she was disappointed. Called Mark to thank him for the flowers that never came. Left a voicemail saying how beautiful they were, in case Everly checked the messages. December 12, 2017. Sandra's youngest broke his arm. Saw it on Facebook 3 days later. We weren't called. We weren't told. I sent a card with money to help with medical bills, signed it from both of us. Everly still doesn't know her grandson was hurt. The deeper I read, the more I understood. Carlton hadn't just been documenting our children's neglect. He'd been actively trying to shield me from the worst of it. He'd been sending cards and gifts that I thought were from both of us, making excuses for their absence, creating a buffer between their indifference and my breaking heart. March 8, 2019. Mother's Day is coming up. Everly has been cleaning the house all week, hoping one of them will visit. I can't bear to watch her disappointment again. Ordered flowers to be delivered, signed the card. Love, Sandra and the kids. Also bought a nice bottle of wine and told Everly it was from Mark. Sometimes I think lying to protect her heart is the most honest thing I can do. I had to stop reading. The weight of his love, his protection, his quiet sacrifice was overwhelming. All these years, I'd thought our children had at least maintained some minimal connection to us. I'd treasured those occasional flowers, those random gifts, those unexpected moments of thoughtfulness. They'd all been from Carlton. He'd spent years of his life and thousands of dollars we couldn't afford, creating the illusion that our children still cared. He'd protected me from the full truth of their abandonment, shouldering that pain alone so I wouldn't have to bear it. I closed the journal and sat on our bed, surrounded by the evidence of a love so deep and selfless that it took my breath away. Carlton hadn't just been my husband, he'd been my guardian, my protector, my buffer against a cruelty he'd never wanted me to fully understand. And he'd done it all in silence, carrying the weight of our children's indifference so I could still believe, somewhere in my heart, that they hadn't completely forgotten us. The house around me felt different now, charged with the presence of a love story I was only beginning to understand. Carlton was gone, but he'd left me something more precious than money or jewelry. He'd left me the truth about who he really was. I spent the rest of that day reading Carlton's journal, and with each page, my heart broke a little more. But it wasn't just heartbreak, I felt. It was awe. The man I'd lived with for 47 years had been carrying secrets that revealed depths of love I'd never fully comprehended. April 15, 2018. Mark's company is in trouble. Saw it in the business section of the Seattle paper online. The article mentioned possible layoffs. I know he's too proud to ask for help, and too ashamed to admit he might need his old man. Sent an anonymous money order for $5,000 to his home address. The note said it was from a satisfied client who wanted to invest in his future. Everly thinks I used that money to fix the roof, but the roof can wait another year. I stared at that entry for a long time. I remembered that spring, remembered Carlton insisting we delay fixing the obvious leak in our bedroom ceiling. He'd said money was tight after some unexpected expenses. I'd assumed he meant the new water heater that had broken down in March. The water heater he'd probably fixed himself to save money for our ungrateful son. I flipped through more pages, each one revealing another secret sacrifice. September 3, 2018. Sandra's oldest starts high school at that fancy private academy. Tuition is $15,000 a year. Derek's business is struggling again. Saw the stress in Sandra's Facebook posts, even though she tries to hide it behind pictures of coffee and inspirational quotes. Took out a loan against my life insurance policy. Sent the money anonymously as a scholarship from a local benefactor. Sandra posted about their good fortune, but never once wondered if maybe her parents had anything to do with it. My hands were shaking. A loan against his life insurance policy? That was money meant to take care of me after he was gone. Money he'd sacrificed to put his granddaughter through private school. A granddaughter who didn't even know our names. October 31, 2018. Halloween. Everly bought candy hoping some of the neighborhood kids would stop by. We got 3 trick-or-treaters all night. She tried to act like it didn't matter, but she kept looking at the pictures Sandra posted of her kids in their costumes. Beautiful kids. Our grandchildren. I wonder if they even know they have grandparents who would give anything just to see them once. I remembered that Halloween, I'd bought way too much candy, secretly hoping Sandra might bring the kids by for a quick visit. Carlton had sat with me on the front porch for hours, both of us pretending we were just enjoying the cool October evening. December 20, 2019. Mark's son got accepted to Stanford. Saw Jennifer post about it on Facebook. The boy doesn't even know we exist, but I'm proud of him anyway. College costs a fortune these days. Started selling my old tools piece by piece. Told Everly I was cleaning out the garage, but really I'm building another college fund. Anonymous, of course. Someday I hope that boy knows his grandfather believed in him, even if he never got the chance to tell him so. I had to put the journal down and walk away. Carlton's tools had been his pride and joy, collected over decades of careful saving and thoughtful purchases. Each one had a story, a job it had helped him complete, a memory attached to it. I'd noticed them disappearing from the garage over the years, but Carlton always had an explanation. Lent to a neighbor, donated to a young man starting out in construction, sold because he didn't need them anymore. He'd been liquidating his life, piece by piece, to provide for grandchildren who didn't know he existed. I made myself a cup of tea and returned to the journal, though reading it felt like examining my own heart under a microscope. March 15, 2020. Pandemic started. Everyone's scared. Everyone's isolated. Called Mark to check if his family was okay. He answered like I was a telemarketer trying to sell him something. "We're fine, Dad. I can't talk right now." 30-second conversation. I worry about them, even though they never worry about us. Everly doesn't know how many times I call them. She'd be hurt if she knew how often they don't answer. May 10, 2020. Mother's Day. Everly tried to act like she didn't care that neither of the kids called. She spent the day gardening, humming to herself. But I know that humming, it's what she does when she's trying not to cry. I ordered her a beautiful bouquet and a card that said, "Thanks for being the best mom in the world. Love, Sandra." The look on her face when it arrived was worth every penny. July 4, 2020. Independence Day. Everly made a big dinner, hoping one of them might stop by for a visit. Mark lives 2,000 miles away, but Sandra's only 4 hours by car. Neither came. We ate potato salad and watched fireworks on TV. I told Everly it was nice to have a quiet holiday. Just us. She agreed, but I caught her staring at Sandra's Facebook posts of their backyard barbecue all afternoon. The entries continued, year after year, painting a picture of a man who loved so deeply that he protected others from his own pain. Carlton had created an elaborate fiction to shield me from the full extent of our children's indifference, and he'd paid for it with his health, his savings, and pieces of his soul. January 8, 2021, Everly's birthday. The kids didn't call again. I bought her a necklace and said it was from Mark, and a silk scarf, and told her Sandra picked it out specially. She was so happy, kept talking about how thoughtful they were to remember her style preferences. I didn't have the heart to tell her I've been buying her gifts from them for 3 years now. August 12, 2021, Sandra's middle child broke his leg at soccer camp. Saw it on Facebook when they posted from the emergency room. We weren't called. We weren't told. I sent a care package with games and books and snacks. Signed it, "From your grandparents who love you." I wonder if Sandra even told him where it came from, or if she just let him think some stranger cared about his recovery. November 25, 2021, Thanksgiving. Everly cooked for 6 people even though it's just us. She always cooks for 6 on holidays, in case they surprise us with a visit. They never do. We'll be eating leftovers for a week, but I'll never tell her to cook less. Hope is sometimes all we have. I found myself crying again, but this time the tears weren't just for grief. They were for gratitude, for the overwhelming realization that I'd been loved more deeply and completely than I'd ever understood. Carlton hadn't just been my husband. He'd been my protector, creating a buffer between me and the harsh reality of our children's abandonment. But as I continued reading, I began to see another pattern emerging. Carlton wasn't just shielding me from pain. He was systematically documenting evidence. Every anonymous gift, every secret loan, Every unreturned phone call was carefully recorded with dates and details. December 25, 2021. Christmas. We sent gifts to all the grandchildren. Spent $800 we couldn't afford, but Everly was so excited to pick out presents for them. The packages were never acknowledged. No thank you calls, no pictures of the kids with their gifts, nothing. I'm starting to think they just throw our packages away without opening them. March 18, 2022. Mark lost his job. Saw it on LinkedIn when he updated his status to seeking new opportunities. Sent another anonymous money order, $3,000 this time. Had to borrow against the house to do it, but I couldn't let him struggle when I had the power to help. Told Everly the bank called about refinancing at better rates. She trusted me to handle the paperwork. The most recent entries were the hardest to read. October 15, 2022. Our anniversary. 46 years married to the most wonderful woman in the world. The kids didn't call to congratulate us. They never do. But Everly and I danced to the beat of the Christmas carols. He'd never mentioned that Tom was struggling financially after his heart attack. Never said that the roof repair was urgent because of the storm damage. He'd just helped. The way he always did. As the reception wound down and people began to leave, Mark and Sandra finally approached me. The three of us stood in the empty church hall, surrounded by folded chairs and the lingering scent of coffee and flowers. "Mom," Mark began, his voice businesslike. "We need to talk about Dad's affairs. The house, the estate, all of that." I looked at him, this stranger who shared Carlton's eyes but none of his warmth. "What about them?" Sandra stepped forward, her tone attempting sympathy but missing the mark. "We know this is a difficult time, but there are practical matters to consider. The house is too big for you now, and maintaining it will be expensive. We've been thinking," Mark continued, "that it might be best to sell it. You could move into a nice senior community, somewhere with people your own age. We could help you find something appropriate." Appropriate. As if my home of 40 years was somehow unsuitable for me now that Carlton was gone. "We could handle all the arrangements," Sandra added, her voice taking on the tone she probably used with difficult customers at her boutique. "List the house, divide the proceeds fairly. It would be so much easier for everyone." I stared at them both, these two people I'd given birth to, raised, loved unconditionally for decades. They'd barely been in the ground with their father for 3 hours, and they were already discussing his estate like a business transaction. "Have either of you asked how I'm doing?" I said quietly. They looked at each other, confused by the question. "I mean, emotionally," I clarified. "Have you asked how I'm handling losing the love of my life? Have you wondered if I'm scared, or lonely, or heartbroken?" Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Of course we care about that, Mom. That's why we think you should be somewhere with more support." "What kind of support?" "Professional support," Sandra said. "People trained to help seniors cope with loss." Seniors? As if I'd suddenly become incompetent the moment Carlton died. "I see," I said. "And where have you been for the past 11 years? Where was your support when your father lost his job? Where were you when he had to cash in his retirement to pay for your emergencies? Where were you when he sold his tools to send money to grandchildren who don't even know his name?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face went pale, and Sandra's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the guilt that flashed across her features. "What are you talking about?" Mark asked, though his voice suggested he already knew. I reached into my purse and pulled out Carlton's journal. "Your father kept a record," I said simply. "Every anonymous gift you received, every loan you never knew about, every sacrifice he made while you pretended he didn't exist." Sandra's eyes fixed on the leather-bound book. "I don't understand." "The money order for $5,000 that helped save your company, Mark? That was your father. He took out a loan against our house to help you." Mark's jaw dropped. That was from a client." "No, it wasn't. It was from a man who loved you enough to bankrupt himself to save your career, even though you hadn't spoken to him in months." I turned to Sandra. "Your daughter's private school tuition, your son's medical bills when he broke, the anonymous scholarships and unexpected windfalls you posted about on Facebook? All your father. He cashed in his life insurance policy to pay for your children's education while he couldn't afford to fix our leaking roof." Sandra's hand flew to her throat. "That's not, we never asked him to." "No, you never asked. You never called. You never visited. You just disappeared from our lives and left your father to watch you from a distance through social media. Loving you enough to bankrupt himself for your happiness." The color drained from both their faces. Mark ran his hand through his hair. A gesture that reminded me painfully of Carlton. "Mom, we didn't know," he said weakly. "Of course you didn't know. Because knowing would have required you to care enough to ask. It would have meant staying in touch, being part of our lives, remembering that your parents existed." I opened the journal to a random page and began to read. Mark's birthday. Everly made his favorite cake and we waited by the phone all day. He never called. She tried to hide how much it hurt. but I saw her crying in the kitchen later. Sandra's perfectly controlled composure began to crack. We were busy, Mom. We had our own families to take care of. Too busy for a phone call? Too busy to acknowledge the gifts we sent your children? Too busy to visit when your father was dying in the hospital? We didn't know he was that sick, Mark protested. I called you both. I told you he'd had a stroke. I told you he might not wake up. You said you'd call back if things got really serious. The words hung in the air like an accusation, because that's exactly what they were. Your father spent the last 11 years of his life trying to prove he was still worthy of your love, I continued. He gave you everything he had and more than he could afford. He protected me from knowing how completely you'd abandoned us. He died believing that somehow, someday, you might remember that he existed. I closed the journal and looked at my children. These successful, wealthy strangers who had once been the center of my universe. And now you want to sell his house, I said. The house he built with his own hands. The house he worked 3 jobs to keep when you were growing up. You want to put me in a facility and divide the proceeds fairly. Neither of them could meet my eyes. Tell me, I said, my voice gaining strength. What exactly would be fair about that? Fair would have been visiting your father while he was alive. Fair would have been calling on his birthday or Christmas or just to say hello. Fair would have been acknowledging the grandfather who loved your children enough to sacrifice everything for them. Mark finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. We made mistakes, Mom. We can do better now. I looked at him, this middle-aged man who still somehow thought he could charm his way out of consequences. No, Mark, you can't do better now. Your father is dead. Your chance to do better died with him in a hospital room where neither of you could be bothered to show up. Sandra started to cry, real tears this time, not the performance she'd given during the funeral. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sure you are, I replied, but sorry doesn't give your father back the respect he deserved. Sorry doesn't return the money he spent on your ungrateful children. Sorry doesn't fill the empty chair in the hospital room where you should have been. I tucked Carlton's journal back into my purse and picked up my coat. The house isn't for sale, I said simply, and neither am I. As I walked toward the church hall exit, leaving my children standing in stunned silence, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of telling the complete truth. 6 months after Carlton's funeral, I stood in the departure lounge at LAX boarding pass in hand, heart racing with an excitement I hadn't felt in decades. My destination, Ireland, specifically County Cork, where Carlton's great-grandfather had been born before immigrating to America in 1923. Carlton had always dreamed of making this trip. He'd researched our genealogy for years, tracing his family back to a small village called Ballyverney. He'd shown me pictures of ancient stone churches and rolling green hills, talking about how someday we'd walk the same paths his ancestors had walked. Someday never came. There was always something more urgent, a bill to pay, a roof to fix, money to send anonymously to ungrateful children. But now there was just me and Carlton's dream and the money he'd hidden away in that safety deposit box. After confronting Mark and Sandra at the funeral, I'd heard from them exactly twice. Once when Mark called to apologize and suggest we work together as a family to heal, I'd hung up on him mid-sentence. The second time was a letter from Sandra's lawyer questioning the validity of Carlton's financial records and suggesting there might be legal issues with the money he'd given away. I'd forwarded that letter to my own attorney with a note. Please inform Mrs. Derek Hastings that all of her father's gifts were legal, documented, and given freely. Any attempt to recover those funds will result in full disclosure of the circumstances under which they were given. I never heard from Sandra's lawyer again. The flight to Dublin was the first time I'd left the country, the first time I'd flown anywhere in over 20 years. Carlton and I had talked about traveling when he retired, but retirement had been one of those someday dreams that never materialized. As the plane lifted off, I pressed my face to the window and watched California disappear below the clouds. We're finally doing it, Carlton, I whispered. We're going to Ireland. I'd booked a 2-week tour that would take me through Dublin, Cork, and the western counties. But first, I had a specific destination in mind. 3 days later, I stood in the village of Ballyvorney, population 847, looking at a weathered headstone in the church cemetery. The inscription was barely legible. Patrick Patterson, 1834 to 1889, beloved father and grandfather, Carlton's great-great-grandfather. I brought a small bag of dirt from our garden in California, soil from the property Carlton had worked so hard to keep. I sprinkled it on Patrick's grave and said a prayer for both of them, the ancestor who'd had the courage to start a new life in a foreign country, and the descendant who'd honored that courage by building something beautiful with his own hands. The church rector, Father O'Sullivan, was a kind man in his 70s who'd been delighted to help me trace Carlton's family connections. Over tea and biscuits in the rectory, he'd shown me parish records going back 2 centuries. Your husband's people were farmers, he told me, pointing to entries in the old ledgers. Good people, from what the records show. They stayed in the area until the famine years, when young Patrick decided to try his luck in America. Carlton would have loved to know that, I said. He always wondered about his roots. Father O'Sullivan smiled. He knew the important parts, I think. The values that matter don't change much from generation to generation. Hard work, family loyalty, faith in something bigger than yourself. Family loyalty. The phrase stuck with me as I continued my journey through Ireland. Everywhere I went, I saw evidence of it. Families gathered in pubs, multiple generations living in close proximity, adult children caring for aging parents. It made me think about how different things might have been if Mark and Sandra had inherited more than just Carlton's eye color. In Galway, I met an elderly woman named Bridget, who ran a small bed and breakfast. She was my age, a widow who'd lost her husband 2 years earlier. Over breakfast one morning, she asked about my family. I have 2 children, I found myself saying, but they're very busy with their own lives. Bridget nodded knowingly. Mine too, love, but they come around when they can. Family is everything, isn't it? I smiled and agreed, not having the heart to tell her that some families aren't worth having. That afternoon, I called my travel agent and extended my trip by another week. Then I called Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor, who'd been checking on my house. Everly, how's Ireland treating you? It's beautiful, Margaret. Everything Carlton said it would be. I'm thinking of staying a bit longer. Good for you. You take all the time you need. The house is fine, and that nice Mr. Kowalski has been keeping an eye on the yard. After I hung up, I realized something remarkable. I wasn't homesick. For the first time in my adult life, I was somewhere Carlton and I had never been together. And instead of feeling his absence, I felt his presence. It was as if he was finally free to travel with me, unburdened by the weight of providing for children who didn't appreciate his sacrifices. In the cliffs of Moher, I stood at the edge of the world and let the Atlantic wind whip my hair around my face. The view was breathtaking, endless ocean stretching toward America, waves crashing against rocks that had stood for millennia. I pulled out Carlton's journal and read one of my favorite entries. I hope someday Everly and I can see the world together. She's given me everything, her love, her loyalty, her faith in me even when I didn't deserve it. I want to give her adventures, memories, something beautiful to look back on. You did give me something beautiful, I said aloud, my words carried away by the wind. You gave me 47 years of feeling completely loved. On my last day in Ireland, I visited a small gift shop in Dublin and bought 2 things, a Celtic cross necklace for myself and a small stone engraved with an Irish blessing. The stone was for Carlton's grave back home. But I also bought something else, a set of postcards featuring Irish landscapes. That evening in my hotel room, I wrote out 2 identical messages. Ireland is beautiful. Carlton would have loved it here. I'm finally living the dreams we never got to share. Mom, I addressed one to Mark in Seattle and one to Sandra in Phoenix. Not because I expected responses, and certainly not because I was ready to forgive them. I sent the postcards because Carlton would have wanted them to know that I was okay, that I was more than okay. He'd spent years protecting them from the consequences of their choices. I was done protecting them from anything. The flight home was bittersweet. I'd fallen in love with Ireland, with the freedom of traveling alone, with the person I'd discovered I could be when I wasn't waiting for phone calls that never came or hoping for visits that never materialized. But I was also eager to get back to the house Carlton had built, to the garden where I'd scattered dirt from Patrick Patterson's grave, to the quiet life I was learning to embrace. Mrs. Henderson met me at the airport with tears in her eyes and a bouquet of flowers from my own garden. You look wonderful, Everly. Different somehow. She was right. I did feel different. I felt like a woman who'd finally stopped apologizing for existing, stopped making herself smaller to accommodate people who didn't care if she existed at all. Back home, I planted the flowers I'd brought from Ireland in Carlton's memory garden, a corner of our backyard where I'd created a small memorial. The Irish soil mixed with California earth seemed symbolic somehow, a blending of dreams and reality, of past and future. That evening, I found 2 messages on my answering machine. One from Mark, awkward and stilted. Mom, got your postcard. Glad you're traveling. Call me when you get back. The other from Sandra, slightly warmer but equally hollow. Ireland looks beautiful, Mom. Hope you had a good time. We should talk soon. I deleted both messages without writing down their numbers. 3 weeks later, I was in my garden when a car pulled into the driveway. Sandra got out looking nervous and overdressed for a casual visit. She'd driven 4 hours to see me unannounced. Hi, Mom, she said tentatively. I hope it's okay that I came by. I continued watering my tomatoes. It's your choice, Sandra. She stood there for a long moment, clearly expecting a warmer welcome. When it didn't come, she tried a different approach. The garden looks beautiful. Dad would be proud. Your father was proud of many things, I replied. Most of them, you never bothered to notice. Sandra flinched but pressed on. I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the funeral. About the money Dad sent us. About everything he did. I turned off the hose and gave her my full attention. I want to pay it back, she said in a rush. All of it. Derek and I figured out how much Dad must have given us over the years, and we want to make it right. I studied my daughter's face, looking for sincerity and finding mostly guilt. And why would you want to do that, Sandra? Because it's the right thing to do. Because we should have been there for both of you. Because Dad deserved better from us. Yes, he did deserve better. But keeping his money won't give him what he deserved. He deserved your respect while he was alive. He deserved phone calls on his birthday and visits on holidays. He deserved to know his grandchildren. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. I know that. I can't change the past, but maybe I can honor his memory now. I looked at this woman who'd once been my little girl, who'd sat on Carlton's shoulders and called him Daddy, and made him feel like the most important man in the world. Somewhere along the way, she'd forgotten who he was. Money wouldn't help her remember. Keep the money, Sandra, I said finally. Your father gave it freely out of love. Returning it now would be an insult to that love. Her face crumpled. Then what can I do? How do I make this right? You can't, I said simply. Some things can't be fixed, only learned from. I started to walk toward the house, then paused. But if you want to honor your father's memory, stop trying to ease your guilt and start being the person he believed you could be. Be a better mother to your children than you were a daughter to him. Sandra was still standing in my driveway when I closed the front door. That night, I sat on Carlton's side of the bed and opened his journal to the last entry he'd ever written. If something happens to me, I hope she'll understand that every choice I made was about love. I understood now. Carlton's love hadn't been about enabling our children's selfishness or protecting them from consequences. It had been about protecting me from the full weight of their indifference, about allowing me to maintain hope even when hope was foolish. His greatest gift wasn't the money he'd hidden in the safety deposit box or even the truth he'd documented in his journal. His greatest gift was showing me that love doesn't require reciprocation to be worthwhile. It only requires a heart big enough to give it freely. I closed the journal and looked around our bedroom, the room we'd shared for 40 years. The space where Carlton had written these entries late at night while I slept beside him, unaware of the burden he was carrying. Tomorrow, I'd call the travel agent and book another trip, maybe Scotland this time or perhaps Wales. Carlton had always wanted to see the Welsh countryside where his mother's family had originated. I had years of delayed dreams to fulfill and a lifetime of love to honor. Not the love I'd wasted on ungrateful children, but the love I'd shared with a man who'd known my worth even when I'd forgotten it myself. For the first time since Carlton's death, I fell asleep peacefully, knowing that his true legacy wasn't what he'd left behind, but what he'd taught me about the courage to live fully, love deeply, and dream boldly, even when you have to do it alone. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.